Chapter 1, Part 2, Practical Female Psychology by Franco and Co. Now, in this chapter, it's here to help guys understand that a lot of the behavior that men and women have when it comes to courtship, when it comes to sex, when it comes to relationships, are actually based on more fundamental evolutionary principles. Now, by breaking it down to be this kind of science and hardware and let the motivations be known, which are different than what we think they are, it's going to remove a lot of the mystique. So as much as men and women like thinking that relationships are magic and women are unknowable and guys are simple, it's just not the case. It turns out, like I said last episode, we're a bunch of meatbags who follow our hardwiring. Our frontal lobe just exists to add a level of... Now, they do a critique here of the R and K selection theory, which a lot of guys talk about, where a girl is either sexually promiscuous or sexually prudish, high libido, low libido. They call it a term, the Madonna whore complex, which they're going to talk about a lot in this book, and we'll get to that later. The point is that survival instinct is not really a very good mechanism to describe female courtship behaviors. In reality, there's a lot of psychological factors that go into it, and we're going to get a broad overview of what they are and how they got into it in this chapter. Quoting Franco, "Furthermore, we see no hard distinction between the biological and the psychological aspects of human beings, but we do consider them as expressions of the whole. If you, the reader, are mystified in the matter of female relationships, some of the material we present in this book may seem to be far away from reality. However, when you observe the principles in action, you will begin to understand the female behavior and female psychology are both perfectly understandable." Again, it's not enough to think there's some separation between the body and the mind here. In this case, we're all evolutionary creatures. We're just animals with the frontal lobe that allows us to use logic and rationale, but those for the most part are manipulative tools. Now, they don't actually talk about it in here, but as an expansion to it, there was a nice study came out of Nature magazine, I think in 2017, 2018, talking about the role of logic. And it's funny because human beings, and from their findings, human beings aren't designed for objective truth. Like, we as a species don't have any mechanisms that allow us to understand the idea of what a quark is, to see atoms in our head, to understand irrational numbers. I'm sure anybody here who visualizes things in their head like geometry and that have a much harder time with those abstract concepts that can't be. Now, the reason that is because humans have a cognitive lazy method of just good enough. And that's why we're not built for logic or rationale. Now, the question became that they asked is, well, what point is there of having logic or of having ration? And it turns out, as a species, we view these as manipulative tools. If I can give you a logical argument, it taps into our innate need for pattern recognition. And once we get that soothing pattern recognition, we're more than willing to go along with the other person. So it turns out it's a social signal. But back to the text. Sexual selection refers to the heritable traits spread through a population, because those traits have either increased the rate of reproduction or increased the rate of survivability, which again has the result of increased propagation through the species. Heritability is stuff that's genetically determined. Pretty straightforward. Anybody who's done any basic Darwin stuff in high school probably knows this already. They make the case that sexual selection can be divided into two main categories: intersexual selection, representing choices made with the opposite sex, and intrasexual selection, representing choices made with respect to the competition within the same sex. Now, I'd argue this is a deceptively important part in here, and they give it very little space, only 4 paragraphs or so. Jeffrey Miller makes the case in his books that most of the time, if things don't make sense, they're generally seen as a sexual signal. And the beauty of sexual signals is there's a process, at least within women, called the commitment skepticism bias. And it's the idea that they instinctively distrust low investment signals. Talk about it all the time. Tell a girl you love her and she'll tell you to piss off. Buy her a diamond ring that costs 3 months' salary and she's definitely going to go down on you. And that's the reason why these things exist. So you'll see a lot of guys who just don't get it and they take a very surface level approach. Diamond rings being the perfect example. There's no resale value to them. They don't increase in value. There's nothing useful about them. There's no reason on earth that women should absolutely love them. except for the fact that you have to spend an exorbitant amount of money and that money is just gone. It's her way of signaling to her friends, look, I got a man that can blow $10,000 on this. What do you got? And more often than not, you'll see this example play out if you've ever seen the engagement party hen circle. I remember this one. I've seen it. Friends before, social events. Girl will get engaged, start showing off her engagement ring to the friends. And they'll all show it off. And they always had to have something. One's like had bigger carats. One had more clarity. One had more color. And then there was always the one girl who had the smaller ring than everybody else. And she was just very quiet. Again, these aren't about showing signals of your love. It's your way of flexing on the frenemies in front of you. Something to think about. On a practical level, think about this intra and intersexual stuff when it comes to Valentine's. If you're one of those guys that has to buy flowers. I actually did this myself. I bought my girl flowers once. Left them in the house. That was very nice. She was very appreciative. Thought it was great. A year later, I sent the flowers to her work. Had that sent to them in like this big ostentatious display. She loved it a lot better. Not because she liked flowers, but because she liked that her friends saw that her man liked her more than their man likes them. Again, the flip side of this thing, though, is working out. Now, girls like muscular men, and guys like to be muscular, but the two grading scales aren't the same here. So, for example, there was a bunch of studies done, and they found that when you asked a girl, what is a muscular man? And you asked a guy what a muscular man was, it turns out the guys expected more muscle, like 25% more. So why is that? If girls tended to be attractive to a certain level of muscularity, why do guys like such a higher level of muscularity? And that's, again, intrasexual competition. That's why you get that meme about the guys going to the gym. Guy who doesn't work out gets all the ladies. The guy works out, gets compliments from a bunch of men. Same thing. This is one of those things that's not about being more attractive to women. It's about cutting out the competition from your own sexual hierarchy here. I use a great example from one of my blog, actually, where I talk about nobody cares about your forward focus. And in my small redneck town, we had moved down there. A bunch of guys saw that the immigrants that were coming to college all had rich parents. They were buying like Supras and Skylines, all kinds of fancy cars, souping them up. But because we're from a crappy redneck town, nobody could afford to do that. So they would buy things like a Ford Focus and put an exhaust system on it or a carbon fiber hood. Every weekend, they would go down to the parking lot across the street from the bar and they would show off. Some guys were spending like their entire tuition just on souping up their car to impress the other dudes. Meanwhile, I was friends with a bunch of guys on the volleyball team and we'd all go down to the bars and hit on girls. One group was big on intersexual competition and the other group was big on intrasexual competition. Now, let me ask you this. Which group do you think got laid more? Let me know in the comments, but I'll tell you right now, you already know which one it is. A big problem with people today is that guys are so focused on intrasexual competition that they completely fit intersexual competition and they forget all about it. Sometimes you realize that when you're competing with other men to cordon off your sexual availability, that you're picking a group that's so atomized that there's just no women in there to compete over. And so you're just wasting your time. You're going to find a lot of guys fall into this trap. And so one of the few things you can take from this chapter is the idea that know who your audience is, know who you're competing with, and not everybody who wants competition is deserving of competition. Sometimes by just not engaging in that certain social circle, you're making yourself better off because that social circle is all unattractive and nobody wants to be the king of shit mountain. And evolutionary psychology proposes that the human brain comprises many functional mechanisms called psychological adaptations or evolved cognitive mechanisms. I'm not going to get into all the details of this, but they're making the case, and I would say pretty well, that in the same way that we're going to have physiological differences between us, like for example, a lot of the Asian populations don't have that little eye crease underneath there, sickle cell anemia, any of those physical traits you can see that can let a guy know probably what country of origin he's from. We have psychological versions of those too. So they don't want to get into too much details about this. They're just going to make two main assertions. One, that female sexuality and female emotional life and that female reproductive mechanisms from the point of view of sexual selection. Those are the 2 points of it. Again, what's in this for me? And I think it's great that they managed to narrow it down there because there's way too many guys that start getting into evolutionary psychology and then branch off into phrenology or some nonsense there. So at least we're on point, thank God. Again, he dips into the idea of high sex drive and low sex drive women. So quoting here, both high sex drive and low sex drive females are useful to nature for different reasons. In the first case, wider genetic variety results. In the second case, greater genetic survivability results. Interestingly, these natural differences have been distorted by men in an attempt to understand them and to cope with the fear caused by them. We believe that male cognitive distortion of these natural feminine traits is the reason for such beliefs within our modern population as the Madonna whore complex, which we discuss extensively later in the book, along with many other examples of the so-called last-minute resistance and anti-slut defense. Those terms are old pickup terms, by the way. Last-minute resistance was the idea that you'd be escalating, things are going well, then all of a sudden the girl starts putting up a big wall, she's not into it, she has to work early in the morning. And anti-slut defense is when she's perfectly happy to be flirted with, to be sexually charged, but then as soon as it sounds like it might be a hit on her reputation, she just clams right up. Both of these things are survivability traits from an evolutionary psychology background. Again, Franco and gang here, they kind of step back from the very in-the-weeds practical part that mystery or a pickup guy would talk about, and they talk about it more from an evolutionary standpoint, which works out well because then you understand the underlying motivations here, as opposed to just, if she does A, do B. If she does B, do C. I mean, that's great, paint by numbers, picking up chicks, but I'd like to think by the time we're here, and like they said at the very beginning, you're past the anger phase, you're past tips and tricks, you're actually on more of a fundamental understanding of female and male relationships. It's funny too, it's something I noticed. So I had my time in the Married Red Pill, a subreddit for guys that were kind of like doing this stuff in the trenches on their own relationships and to see the results from it. And there was another, I don't want to call it a sister subreddit, but a complementary subreddit called Dead Bedrooms, where people who had been in a sexually deprived relationship for a length of time would go in there and complain. And the one thing they loved to do was talk about high libido women and low libido women. The idea is if you weren't having sex with your wife, that meant she was low libido and it was just something you had to work around. Like the thought never occurred to them that she's not low libido, she's just not attracted to you. She's not low libido, but she never did like you. She just had baby rabies. And when she had her baby, she didn't really care to sleep with you anymore. Again, female sexuality is very reactive. And there's certain theories as to why. The one that I mostly ascribe to is that guys are outies and girls are innies. So ever since we were kids, guys had a visual representation of when we were attracted to something. So we just intuitively knew. Meanwhile, girls tend not to know they're attracted to something until it's already too late. They just feel things and they go with the flow, and by the time they're aware of it, oops, I just slipped and fell on this dick, my bad. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but it helps me visualize it, so I stick with it. Other than the slipping part, don't visualize that, trust me. But there's also the case that these aren't static things. And Rollo Tomassi talks about it with his SMZ, sexual market value graph over time, where he talks about the girls 19 to 22 want to sleep with a bunch of dudes as long as they're hot. The foam parties in Cancun, he likes to call it. When a girl hits 28 to 32, that's when baby rabies sinks in. All of a sudden, she has the desire to be a stay-at-home wife and bake bread all day wearing a sun hat. And, you know, if you just did more dishes, maybe I'd be more comfortable to have sex. And they both have their role. As a younger girl, the genetic diversity is probably a good role to have. In the older girl, probably sexual stability is the good role to have, as it includes higher chances of survivability. That's also why, if you notice, a lot of guys, when they get back into the dating realm after they are older, they start to notice, you know, they get divorced at 40, they start dating girls at their age, and they find that girls at their age are a completely different life place than them. They want to put them through all kinds of hoops. I need 7 dinners, a $5,000 dowry before I even think about making out with you. Meanwhile, they're like, you know what? I'm just going to go have fun. This 23-year-old just wants to have fun and party. Good enough for me. Makes the older ones mad, and that's when they start delving into, like we talked about before, the intersexual competition. And that's where you get a lot of the shaming tactics and all that other stuff. But again, take a look at all these ways that men and women interact, and you're going to start noticing so much of it fits within the realm of sexual signaling between male and female, and male and male, and female and female. Altruism and selfishness is the next one. So to start off with the quote here, many men, especially men who have become emasculated by women, fail to understand the real evolutionary meaning of female altruism and or selfishness, which truly depends on the circumstances. They fail to see it as a continuously changing process that occurs within the same woman, and instead they tend to view it in a more static and conflictual way. Men who become physically unfit in relationships learn very quickly that women have no compunction against kicking a man when he's down. As David says, she needs to feel that he is the same strong bastard that she was initially attracted to, even when he's sick in bed with the flu. This is a purely selfish response from the woman for evaluating on an emotional level the man's continued fitness. Man flu, basically. Now, you guys may have heard of something in the sphere called fitness tests or shit tests, and this kind of describes that to a T. The idea is a girl always wants to look up to a guy. Girls don't want their equal, they don't want their lessers, they want their betters. And that's encapsulated within the concept of something called hypergamy. If you don't know, hypergamy is just a girl saying, I always want the best, without a doubt. In this case, you'll hear a lot of girls whine when their man gets sick, he starts acting like a big baby. He actually doesn't. Most guys, when we get sick, just act sick. But the girl sees that little bit of weakness and just pounces on him. It's not purposeful, it's instinct. Again, evolutionary psychology. This is all based on adaptations. And the idea of a girl back in the caveman days was if she didn't have a man with a cudgel, next tiger walking around is going to kill her. So every time her man starts acting weak, she has to test to make sure he's still strong and it's like a temporary setback. Okay, he's just got a cold. That's good. I dunked on him for 20 minutes and he told me to shut up and then punch through a wall. Good. At least now I know once he gets better, he's still fighting lions and tigers. But in the case where the guy ends up becoming less useful over the long term, a girl has to think about survivability and move on. How applicable is that to the modern life? Well, I'm sure everybody's got stories of when they were down in their luck and they tried to lean on their woman for support and she basically shit all over them. So you take it for what it's worth. Charles Bukowski, Jordan Peterson, Neil Strauss. I like these guys. Add some salt to cover up the bitterness of middle-aged soccer moms and put in the oven for 45 minutes. Optionally, you can take from all this stuff what you want and leave the rest. So enjoy Fuck Files. 15 lessons from a decade of women, now on audio. Another good point that Franco and the boys here make is the idea of that tradcon fantasy of the women standing by their man's side until death do us part. First off, there's been a few guys in the sphere that I've talked to over the years that used to work on the end-of-life place for men, and they've given me all kinds of stories about how women are just horrible when the guy's on death's door. I know an example I remember from like 2 weeks ago was this guy was about to die from cancer treatment. His final wish was for his wife to bring the kids down to see him one last time, and she couldn't be bothered to, so just didn't do it, didn't talk to the family at all, brought a new date down to the funeral. Now, I know that's an extreme story, but it makes a good point. It's as soon as you're no longer useful from that evolutionary perspective, as soon as that light switch changes, it's like nothing you ever did mattered, it doesn't exist, and the girl will feel really bad and have a lot of anxiety, but at the same time, if you're looking for a shoulder to cry on, the shoulder just won't be there. Moving on, among humans, altruism can be observed when comparing a woman from a more traditional, patriarchal country to a woman with a more politically correct, industrialized country. A woman of traditional, patriarchal countries will be more motivated in terms of altruistic behavior towards her husband, that is, the family's provider, because the role of the family and patriarchy is still seen as more important in those countries. In fact, supporting her man by sacrificing herself will increase the likelihood of spreading her own genes to her children. This altruistic effect is virtually lost in politically correct Western countries, such as that a woman's motivation for altruistic behavior towards her husband, the provider, may be almost non-existent or limited to short periods of time between getting pregnant to the early years of the infant's upbringing. Selfishness emerges when the woman can induce a man to pay for the children without impinging on her freedom via state-sanctioned mechanisms of child support. This selfishness provides the woman with material support for children by one man, while allowing her to become impregnated by another man with little or no material or social risk to herself. Again, I don't think they make the case. I still think they attribute this too much to choice, but it's essentially an adaptation to environment. When he says patriarchal societies, what he means is developing countries. Places where starvation and death and violence are a part of life. And so, yeah, in that case, the saying goes, the strongest weapon or the best weapon for a man is a gun. The best weapon for a woman is a man with a gun. So if you're in one of these old school societies, and like our grandparents were kind of there too, the idea of sticking by your man's side is more of a survival trait. So the altruism was there, But it's not so much altruism as it is self-interest wrapped in altruism. But we become more abundant, we get better widgets, the cops sort out all the crime, none of this stuff matters, and so the girl behavior adapts. And in this case, I don't need a man for protection. I already got protection. I don't need a man for a job. I can already send my own emails. I don't need a man for support because the government's just going to have me pay child support anyway. Now, when all these things that you need a man for are no longer there, what's left? Basically, what do you want? And that's the idea of luxury branding for masculinity in the modern age, which I've made a case for in Rule Zero Live, our live presentations. Zoom, unfortunately, because we had a COVID event. We were supposed to have it live, but we'll get that one soon. Here's hoping that the flu thing will finally be over. But again, bringing home the bacon doesn't count anymore when bacon costs $3 at the grocery store and the girl's making 60 grand a year. So in this case, it's not so much that people think of these things as more beneficial or they believe them to be more beneficial. It's just from a survival and psychological standpoint, they're either necessities or they're not necessities. And right now, from an evolutionary standpoint, the ability for a man to adapt to this changing environment and treat yourself more as a luxury good as opposed to a commodity requirement is going to be key to moving forward happy in the sexual marketplace. The next section is practical advice. They say it's not mandatory to accept all the tenets of evolutionary psychology in order to be successful. However, this is going to broaden your study. Again, this is where I like the promise that they had put in the early chapter. They're basically going to expose the reader to all kinds of different mental models and concepts. Now, some of them will be helpful, some of them will not be helpful. It's up to you to use the brain matter between your ears to figure out which are which. But the idea here is there's going to be a large amount of concepts that are going to be helpful in a compartmentalized method. Again, tools in a toolbox, praxeology. We're not trying to make men think a certain ideology or another. We're not trying to convince you that, liberals and conservatives or blah, 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 or, move to Russia or stay in America or move to, none of that stuff. With the place as it is right now, here are the base psychological drives of men and women, which are more set in stone than we'd like to admit. It doesn't paint a pretty picture for us. Again, we're just meat bags following our instinctual wiring, using our hardwiring or using our software to help us through. But once you understand that, it lets you navigate. And this is a big reason why they say you shouldn't read this book if you're still in the anger phase, if you have still resentment built up towards women, if the models you have don't align with the models of reality when it comes to men and women, because you're going to look at this stuff and see it as women don't live up to any of these expectations. Damn those beasts. As opposed to, this is the way women are. I'm going to adapt and I'm going to overcome. And then I'm going to find out life is going to be damned good. Because I'm telling you right now, as much as everybody talks about the dating market is trash right now and women are horrible and men are so downtrodden, once you learn to navigate it successfully, all this stuff goes away. It's just wonderful. It turns out it's not the world that's messed. It's a man's expectations. They're going to bring, and then for the rest of this book, they bring in 3 pieces of information here, 3 books that are good for future study. That's Matt Ridley's The Red Queen, Robert Baker's Sperm Wars, and Jeffrey Miller's The Mating Mind. Each of these books are written by an expert in their field. Brief reviews of each follow below. And they talk about all 3 of them, but the gist of it is The Red Queen, where they make the case that girls' evolutionary selfish adaptations actually help them from a survivalship standpoint. I think the one case they make in here is that a girl is more likely to be knocked up when she has an affair as opposed to just sleeping with her man. Now, you might think of that as some kind of, how does the body know if you're cheating on a guy? It's not really the case at all. What happens is girls, when they go through their cycles, there's an ovulatory phase where they feel the horniness. And then there's a refractory phase and flow, that kind of thing, where they feel less than sexual. And that's the weeks they don't shave their legs. And a lot of guys will notice this. All of a sudden, the girl's not sexual. She always has a headache. She doesn't want to sleep with them. And then all of a sudden, one weekend, she puts on makeup to go to work, wears a nicer dress, a little more cleavage. Maybe she wants to have a girls' night out. Again, it's an extreme case, but it kind of gets the idea here. And it's not so much that girls are easier to get pregnant when they're cheating. It's just that when they're in their ovulatory shift, they tend to act more sexually charged. They tend to have a higher libido. And so they go and they change their behaviors. So they basically wait until they're able to be knocked up. And that's when they decide to go cheat on their schlubby guy back home who thinks that altruism is what you need to expect. take it for what it's worth. Sperm Wars is a neat one, and it generally makes the case on the genetic polarity between the two female mating strategies, R selection and K selection. The idea that higher libido sexual functions increase the wideness of the gene pool, while male behaviors end up narrowing it. So what do I mean by this? Well, that means, and they're going to talk about it in a future chapter, the betaization process of men. The idea is you get attracted to a man, you get him attached to you, you get knocked up by him. And usually between the kids' ages of 1 and 5, a girl is like dependent on a guy. That's the formative years. That's just a hardwiring thing. But then after about 5 years old, the man goes from being essential to being nice to have. And you'll notice for a lot, like go talk to any of your divorced friends. When did your parents get divorced? And you would be surprised how many of them are between the ages of 5 and 7 years old. It's almost like it's clockwork. But that's the thing. So that girl then can go get a second husband, have another kid with him, 5 years, in some cases, even 3 husbands. You create a wider genetic diversity, and that ends up increasing the survivability of the species. So as much as guys talk about creating your legacy and something with genetic winners and genetic losers, just remember, if a girl's playing that game too, she's probably going to divorce you when the kid's 5. So I don't know if that's a ball of wax you want to open up. And then The Mating Mind by Jeff Miller, wonderful book. He makes the argument that everything is about selection signals. And I think he talks about it all the time on Twitter, but if you're seeing somebody do something that's completely nonsensical and makes no sense, like it's an expensive waste of time or money or resources or opinions, chances are the more irrational it is, the more than likely there's a sexual availability signal to it. Great example of this, for those who don't know, hipster girls. I'm sure you've all seen them. They wear like the dumbest crap, stupid haircuts, garbage bags on their waists. These are all expensive sexual signals saying, I can make myself look absolutely horrid and I could still get a man. It's a way of flexing on other women. Same thing with like goofy colored hair or girls that talk about their Xanax addictions. All these times they're playing wounded to tap into that male need to save a girl. And they're actually using it as a sexual selection signal. So when you're thinking, why is this girl talking about her alcoholism? Why is this girl talking about how she's hooked on pills? Why is this girl talking about how broken she is? Well, she's doing that because it attracts a certain type of man, and that's literally what she's doing now, even if she doesn't know it, even if she's just doing it subconsciously. So that's something to think about here. They end this chapter on not taking it too seriously. It's infotainment. Basically, take the autism when you read this stuff and dial it down to like a 4. Understand this stuff on a broad level. Don't take it take it seriously, but don't take it literally. That's like the red pill motto. Take this stuff seriously, don't take it literally. That's why most of the detractors take everything literally, but they don't take anything seriously. So I'm going to end this on the quote though. Our experience, however, is our own. We're positive that if men test our theories within the realm of everyday experiences with women, they will find them to be extremely practical. We encourage you to maintain an open mind, to read the books reviewed above, and to read more on the topic from a variety of sources found in the bibliography. Yeah, we're not at opinion pieces. These guys have done their research. So this is it for chapter 1. Again, what have we done so far? We've laid the groundwork of evolutionary psychology and its role in human interactions in male and female sexuality. We're letting you know that it's not magic. We're not infinite variety. People are generally very predictable. People generally have motives for what they do. Female altruism only exists in a place where female survival is dependent on men, in case developing countries, which is probably why a lot of guys end up going to Brazil or Russia to try and find themselves a girlfriend or bride, like Roosh and them, because they think they can tap into that. And it gets you a little bit of a benefit for a time, but the way globalism is moving right now, even the BRIC countries are pretty damn prosperous now. And so you're going to be more likely to find that small town Polish girl to be on OnlyFans as she is to be married at 18. Something to think about. So I'll catch you guys on the next one where we talk about female neuropsychology. I'll catch you later. Cheers.